So as we come to chapter 11, as I just said a moment ago, we come to the end of what might be termed this sort of first section or first sermon of Moses. From chapter 1 until now, we have seen repeatedly these pleas, exhortations, encouragements of Moses to this second generation of Israelites. Love God, obey his commands, don't get sidetracked. And as this section closes, so after Christmas, as we then pick up on chapter 12, we'll see from chapter 12 to 26 the more detailed laws being set out. If you like, those family, those community, those religious laws or frameworks, which are basically a breakdown of what love God and love neighbor should look like. And as we look at chapter 11, what we quickly notice is that much of what we see here is, to all intent and purpose, a repetition and a re-emphasis of what we've already seen. From chapter 1-ish to now, we've gone round and around and around the same sort of things. Obey God, don't get sidetracked, don't be tempted, etc., etc. And here we see Moses reminds them again to look back, not just to Egypt, but to the wilderness. See what God has done. He rescued you. He redeemed you from slavery. And this exodus from Egypt, this crossing of the Red Sea, becomes in the New Testament symbolic of salvation and baptism. God has redeemed us. He has rescued us from the slavery, our slavery to sin, and has, through the waters of baptism, brought us into, or has sort of set us on, a journey toward the promised land. We are saved, if you like, but we are still being saved. The Israelites had come through the Red Sea and they were free, but they were still walking towards their freedom, if I can put it like that. And if we ponder this, we might see it reminds us, as we sort of see this imagery and this symbolism, that today, as God's children, we're not in the promised land. So are we in the wilderness? God has led us out of our slavery to sin and is leading us through and toward. So it's an interesting, as we reflect on that symbolism, what does it mean for my salvation? I am saved, but I am still being saved, if that makes sense. And we see in the wilderness that they rebel against God, they make mistakes, they get things wrong, they have to come back. Moses pleads for their forgiveness, they plead for their forgiveness. And we know something of that in our own Christian journey. So it's interesting, that sort of symbolism and sort of imagery that we see. And then we see this reference to these two men, Dathan and Abiram. And that becomes interesting because we see what they did in Numbers chapter 6. And they did that with one of the Levites, a chap called Korah. And they tried to rebel against God. They tried to rebel against Moses. And what they wanted to do was to lead Israel back to Egypt. They wanted to go in the opposite direction to God. They, like Pharaoh, sought to thwart God's plan, and they were punished. And so for us today, it perhaps encourages us to be more alert and aware. What is God's plan for his church today? And are we walking in that way? And then we see how Moses reminds them that they were eyewitnesses. And it's interesting that both Peter in his letters in the New Testament and John, they would say the same. We were eyewitnesses to these things. And it's this idea that seeing it for yourself, or someone who has been an eyewitness telling you, it develops faith and trust. It gives more credibility and weight to what is being said. And we see again this echo that they're to bind these experiences to themselves. Don't forget what God has said. Don't forget what God has done. And then we see in verse 26 what we'll see opened out in much more detail in chapter 28, towards the end of Moses' letter. We see Moses introduces this concept. He sets forth this idea of a blessing and a curse. And Moses says, it's your choice. God was not going to force them to love him and obey him. Our love for God is and must be an expression of our own free will. We must choose. Obedience might come with blessing, but they would find out, as we now know, it still comes with struggles. We have chosen to follow Christ, and yet, again, using that imagery of the wilderness, we still struggle. We still face times when it feels dry and barren, and we're called to, in that, to still continue to trust. We know God's blessings, yes, but actually, if you like, they come with a price, because even knowing God's blessing, we still know the struggles of journeying with him. But this idea of choice, I set before you today a blessing and a curse. And it's still the same for us today. God says, here I am. And he asks us to choose. Will we choose to follow him or not? So I'll stop there.